Hi, and welcome to Train Signal. We're continuing our Windows Server 2012 Advanced Services course. This lesson focuses on disaster recovery. It's important to consider that as we roll out all this important technology, we configure our Windows Server 2012 systems to do exciting things. It's important to make sure that we know that the data that we create, the actual value being created by our knowledge workers and other employees in the company, are protected from harm. There's a lot of information that we in some cases literally bet the company on. We bet the organization's security. We bet the organization's long-term health and stability on the presence of certain data. And there are any number of horror stories of good businesses that entirely went out of business because of the loss of critical data that they were not able to recover from. You want to ensure that if the boss comes to you and says, hey, are we okay if there's a data loss, if there's a power outage, if there's a hard drive failure, if a server catches fire, are we okay? Do we have that data someplace where we can get at it? Well, that's an important question. We want to be able to recover all the important data that's part of our organization's work. With that idea in mind, we're going to want to be able to have access to a strategy to be able to identify those critical resources in our organization. What are the things that we can't live without? How about the payroll server database? How about the client list, contact information for all of our customers? How about order processing history? Which orders have we fulfilled and for whom? How about accounts receivable information? Who owes us money? So these and many other critical resources are things that we need to put some attention upon. We need to make sure that we've got a good sense of what information is most valuable. What do we need to absolutely protect for fear of loss of the whole organization for the loss of that data? And then identifying what kinds of risks are associated with that data. What are the things that can go wrong? If it's on a hard drive, I need to worry about the hard drive failing. If that hard drive is in a local server in my office, I need to worry about what happens if that server is destroyed. If it's in a particular building, I need to worry about what happens if that building is demolished. If it's in a particular city, I need to worry what if a disaster strikes that city. This is something that can eventually escalate to a fairly expensive process of trying to make sure that we've got good coverage of all of the potential dangers in our organization. So having located the critical resources, the information that our company just can't live without, and having then identified the potential risks, the things that can go wrong with that data, our next logical step in building a recovery strategy is figuring out what are we going to do to be able to recover if those risks in fact occur. What's our get back to working plan? And there's a whole separate field of study. We could do a whole course on the subject of how to build disaster recovery plans. How do I strategize what data gets recovered in what order? Where is that data stored? Who's responsible for restoring it? All that stuff can be built into binders of information about how to recover from a disaster. And then, of course, we hope we never need to implement the plan. But big businesses will spend lots of time and money developing exactly these kinds of recovery plans. Windows provides a couple of different technologies that we can apply to be able to help support that process. And the main focus of this particular lesson is going to be on the Windows Server Backup utility. But rather than jump right into the Windows Server Backup tool first, I'm going to back into that by way of a other companion technology in Windows that's going to help support what we do in the Windows Server Backup tool, but also is a very, very useful, helpful tool in its own right. Something called Volume Shadow Copy. Volume Shadow Copy Services was added to the Windows platform in Windows Server 2003. Prior to that point, if I wanted to be able to do a backup and a restore, I had access to the Windows Backup utility. I had access, of course, to lots of third-party tools, and we still do. But Volume Shadow Copy provided a new opportunity to improve the efficiency of managing the backup and restore process. Consider what happens ordinarily. The user destroys some file or damages it, calls the help desk, says, help, I need a file, and somebody gets in their car and drives across town to the place where we store our backup tapes, gets the tape, brings it back to the office, loads it up, brings the user into the server room, says, all right, which one of these files is yours? The user stumbles to find the right file, we restore it. It's a long hassle, it's a complex process to be able to restore that user's piece of data. It would be nice if there was a simpler, faster, more elegant solution for that. Volume Shadow Copy provides exactly that kind of a shortcut to solving that problem. Volume Shadow Copy will perform an automatic backup of a sort. There's some very, very clear limitations to it, but it does provide a mechanism with which to be able to make a backup of critical files to be able to make it easy for IT or indeed for the user themselves to recover an older version of a file back before some bad luck befell that file, be it the user making some unfortunate modification or the deletion of the file or anything along those lines. So let me show you the Volume Shadow Copy service and its companion, the Previous Versions of Files feature. So here I am on server 1. Let me go ahead and create some content that we want to be able to protect. We're going to simulate some data that's a must-have. Our company must have it or we're going to go out of business. So let me carve out some space here on drive C for some important data. I'll build a new folder. Called Important Data. I'm going to make that a shared folder. I'm going to give everybody change control on it, just to be able to make it easy to demonstrate a harmful modification. Real world, you don't want to give everybody the ability to do that, but I'm going to do it for the purposes of my demo. Inside of that shared folder, I'm going to create an important file. You can see it's important. It says so right there on the name of the file. And inside of it is important data. All right. It says so right there. All right. So I got an important file sitting in an important directory. I want to make sure nothing happens to it. So what am I going to do? What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on Volume Shadow Copy services. To do that, I'm going to right-click the drive that contains the information that I want to protect and configure shadow copies. Alternatively, I could have taken a different route there. Right-click my drive, pulled up properties of the drive, gone to its shadow copies tab. Either way, same result, same location. In which I'm going to enable shadow copy services. I can choose to do so on a per drive basis. I can do it on some drives but not others. If there's critical information on one drive but not on another, I may choose not to turn it on for all of them. In this case, I'll turn it on for drive C. Am I sure I want to enable shadow copies now? Sure. And after thinking for a moment, it creates a shadow copy for me. Now, what did it just do? What it did was it kind of memorized what was happening on that server at this point in time. In a summarized sort of a fashion. Shadow copy sets aside a certain area of storage. I can configure exactly where and how much space with this settings dialog box. And inside of that space, which by default is 10% of the size of my drive, I've got a 130 gig drive. It's set aside 13 gigs of storage for that. Within that chunk of space, Volume Shadow Copy is able to store information about changes that occur on my drives. Ordinarily, I make a change on a drive, and the only place that that change takes effect is the place where the file resides that I'd made a change to. That seems kind of obvious, but Shadow Copy actually stores a separate storage area of a size that you get to specify that stores information about changes that it sees taking place in the file system. If I delete a file ordinarily, Windows Explorer notifies the operating system that the file has been deleted. The operating system marks that file for deletion, and it's now eligible to be written over by some other program. When Shadow Copy is turned on, though, when I delete that file, the original data is marked for deletion, but a copy of all of that content that got deleted is moved into the Volume Shadow Copy area. If I make a change to a file, if I replace some piece of a file with some other information, I delete a paragraph from a memo and write in a new one, what happens to the old paragraph? Well, ordinarily, in the case of a ordinary file, that data is gone forever. I've removed that piece of the file. The file is now a little bit smaller. It no longer has that piece of data. It's gone. It's been, again, released back to the operating system to be used in some other way. But in the case of Shadow Copy, the new paragraph is added to the document. The old paragraph that was deleted is put in the Volume Shadow Copy area. And periodically, the system takes something called a Volume Shadow Copy snapshot. Now, one way to be able to create that is to click the button here that says Create Now. So I can manually create a Volume Shadow Copy snapshot. And the system will remember what everything looked like as of that point in time and sets aside an additional partition within our storage area, 13 gigs in my case. It sets out a separate partition of space inside of that region to start tracking more changes. By keeping that snapshot of what things look like at a particular point in time, Windows will be able to roll back a file to an earlier point in history based upon the information that lies in that volume shadow copy area. So I can force the creation of a snapshot. Beyond that, all Windows servers since Server 2003, when they turn on volume shadow copy, will by default perform a couple of shadow copy snapshots on a schedule. And that schedule by default will involve snapshots at 7 a.m. and noon every business day of the week. Now I can adjust that. I can add more or fewer times. I can have it run more frequently. Microsoft will recommend that you don't run it more often than once per hour. There is a performance trade-off in doing this. So if you've got that many changes, shadow copy might not be your best solution. You might want to look for some other backup and restore solution other than this. In this case, this will be fine. This means that if a user comes in at 8 in the morning, a little bleary-eyed, and inadvertently deletes a file, they can restore it back to where it was at 7 a.m. If they come back from lunch and at 1:30 post-lunch coma sets in, as their body starts to digest lunch, then they inadvertently make a change to a file that they didn't mean and hit save and go, whoops, uh-oh, how do I get that file back to where it was? They'll be able to snap it back to where it was at noon. So I like those default schedules. I think those work very, very well logically. I'm going to click OK here because I didn't make any change. And maybe this is a lightly changed server. I'm going to change my maximum storage size for shadow copy down to something smaller. Maybe 4 gigs is fine as far as I'm concerned. So there we go, 4 gigs. I'm going to click OK. And having done that, I'm going to click OK to close up my properties of my C drive. So shadow copy has been enabled. A snapshot was created at the moment that I installed and enabled the volume shadow copy feature. Now what sort of an effect does that have on my environment? To illustrate that, let me jump over to my Windows 8 client. Let's look at things from the client's perspective. So here's my Windows 8 client. I'm going to go ahead and launch Windows Explorer. In it, I'm going to go browse to my shared folder, /nyc-svr1 /important data, inside of which is an important file. Inside that important file is data that is awfully important, and my user decides to make a change to that file. And without thinking what they're doing, they go ahead and save that change. And then they realize, oops, I've made a dreadful mistake here. I just deleted weeks worth of work in that file. How do I get it back to where it was? And what ordinarily happens is the user calls the help desk, and the help desk dispatches somebody to get in their truck and drive across town, go get the data tape. You know the story. I would like to be able to economize on that time. I'd like to be able to say to the user, no problem, I can restore that for you right now. Right now, says the user. How do you do that? Or, if I've got particularly smart users, I would like to be able to say, yeah, why don't you go ahead and restore it to the user. The user says, me? Restore it? I'm not IT. It's possible. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to have the ability to quickly restore basic user data back to a particular point in time in the relatively recent past that the user can recognize, where we might even again be able to hand off responsibility for that restoration to the user themselves, dramatically cutting down on the amount of effort that the help desk needs to put in to be able to manage all that data. That would be cool. Can we do it? We can. Here's how. From either the user's perspective or from the IT person's perspective, so either here on the client or on the server, somebody, maybe the user, maybe IT, is going to right-click that file and choose to restore previous versions. Once again, it's possible for the user to, instead of going here, to open up Properties and to visit the Previous Versions tab there. Same outcome either way. And I can see that there's a version of this file that existed from an earlier point in time. It's an important file. It says so right there. And I can do one of a couple things here right now. I can just open that file and see what it looked like way back at that point in time. Now, you know and I know that that was minutes ago, but that might have been weeks or months ago. And there's the original version of the file. So how did it store that? What happened was, when I deleted this part of my file, important, shadow copy took that set of data blocks that I deleted and put them in the volume shadow copy area. The rest of the content is in the file in its current location in my important data share. All that data is still in the file. That is the current file. Everything that I don't have highlighted at the moment is currently in the file. But Windows knows what data I removed since the point that I took the snapshot shortly after creating the file. So it sees what it looks like now. It knows what I took out earlier. It can logically bolt those pieces of information together to show me what the file looked like before I removed that data. Having confirmed that this is the file that I want, I can close up my Notepad window and say that yes, I would like to please restore that file back to full health. Having clicked restore, it says, are you sure you want to set this back to that earlier point in time? Sure I do. File's been restored. I no longer have a previous version showing up in my dialog box. And if I go back and open up my important file, it's back to full health. That's neat. Let's do something different. Let me delete that file. Am I sure I want to delete it? Sure, I'm sure. File's gone. Now what do? I call the help desk as a user, or maybe I know that I get to restore previous versions of things. I'm going to back up a level and right-click this important data folder and restore a previous version of it. And I can see that that folder existed at a particular point in time, and I can restore it back to full health. Now there's a potential danger there. What if there's just one file in there that I had unfairly damaged in some fashion? If I restore the whole folder, there might be a number of files that are perfectly fine the way they are. So what do I do to be able to restore just some part but not another? What I might do is choose a copy that says, let's take that folder of data, and instead of restoring it to its original location, I can choose to put it somewhere else instead, like on the desktop. So now, that important data that I restored is over here on my desktop in its full-fledged format, and it's of course missing from its intended location. Having confirmed that everything is good, I can move data right from my copy back to where it belongs, and I'm back in business. That's nice if I meant to restore just a couple of files from a whole directory. That might be able to save the trouble of throwing away lots of good data as part of my restoration process. So Volume Shadow Copy is really wonderful functionality to be able to dramatically improve the speed and efficiency with which I can resolve a customer's question at the help desk saying, hey, can you help me restore this important file because I need it for my 3 o'clock meeting. There exists an interesting possibility that multiple users might fight over the shadow copy feature. This is the right version. No, that's the right version. No, this is the right version. It is possible through group policy to remove from a user access to the previous versions of files feature, and in some cases that might be a good choice. So now let's shift gears and apply this volume shadow copy idea to our mainline backup and restore tool, Windows Server Backup. So I've moved back to Server 1 to be able to run the Windows Server Backup tool, and somewhat intriguingly, Microsoft has decided to put a reference to Windows Server Backup in the Server Manager Administrative Tools menu, leading to the logical but mistaken conclusion that it's installed by default. If I click Tools and scan down to the bottom of that list, way down to the bottom, there's Windows Server Backup. Let me click Windows Server Backup. The GUI comes up. Looks like I got an option to do a local backup. Okay. Let me select local backup and right click, and it says Windows Server Backup is not installed on this computer. What? I'm looking at it. Well, sort of. I've got part of the GUI here, but I haven't installed the components in the back end to be able to actually do backups. So back to Server Manager I go. I'm going to go manage my server by adding a role or feature. In this case, it's going to be a feature. I'm going to add it to Server 1. The role in question is not a role, it's a feature. The feature is Windows Server Backup. And that's going to take a moment to do its thing, so let me push the magic train signal accelerator button to be able to accelerate that Windows Server Backup installation process. And there we go. So we've finished installing the Server Backup utility. Let me jump back to the GUI and refresh it. We can see the last backup status. There wasn't one. Next backup time, it doesn't know of one. I can now prepare to do a local backup. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click Local Backup over here. Note that gives me the exact same set of options that we see over here off to the right in the Actions area. Those are equivalent to each other. Doing a basic backup, I could do a backup once, which is to say I want to trigger a backup just at the moment, but I don't intend to do it necessarily ever again. Or when I do, I want to be able to choose to do so manually. Alternatively, of course, I could schedule a backup. When I go to do a backup, it gives me a choice of, do I want to reuse settings that I've used in the past in a backup, or do I want to choose a totally different set of backup options for this particular backup? In this case, I've never done one before, so I only have the option of doing different options, which is to say new options. In so doing, my next question is, what do I want to back up? The whole server or just pieces of it? If I choose to back up a custom backup, I then get to choose which items. Something that was new as of Server 2008 and 2008R2 is the bare metal recovery backup. Bare metal recovery, you'll notice, gives me more or less the whole system. All the partitions that are necessary to make my Windows system functional. If I've got additional data partitions that don't contain the operating system, they're not the boot partition that has the OS files, it's not the system partition that has the boot files. If it's neither of those things, then it won't be included by default in a bare metal recovery backup. But certainly the folder that contains the OS files and the files needed to get the OS up and running initially are part of a bare metal recovery backup. Bare metal meaning that I can restore back to an empty hard drive in the event of a disaster where the computer is entirely wiped out. I can buy an empty blank chassis with equivalent equipment and restore not only the data that I care about, but the actual running copy of Windows back to that server. In earlier releases prior to Windows Server 2008, I couldn't do a Windows backup of the operating system and restore it because the application needed a running copy of Windows to be able to do the restore. Server 2008, 2008R2, and Server 2012 use a version of the backup tool that can be run from something called the Windows Recovery Environment, the WinRE environment. WinRE is based on the Windows PE, the Windows Pre-Installation Environment Operating System, which is a minimalistic, stripped-down version of Windows meant to be used for imaging and for troubleshooting tasks like restoring a bunch of damaged files to a server. Separately, of course, I could pick other pieces of my installation. I could just choose to back up the contents of the C drive. I could just target my other partition. It's a reserved partition. It doesn't have a drive letter. I could just back up system state. System state includes basic information necessary to get the system minimally off the ground. So again, the startup files, the registry. If it's a domain controller, it includes the Active Directory database. If it's a certificate server, it includes the certificate database. So the critical components of that system are described in a system state backup. For the purposes of my demonstration, I'm just going to grab the important files that I care about. There's my important data directory. I'm going to add that to my backup. Having added all the items that I need, I've got advanced settings at my disposal. Those settings include the ability to exclude certain unwanted files. There you're given an example there of MP3 files or temp files. Maybe I've got a problem with people putting copies of pictures, JPEG files, on my server. They copy their vacation photo archive up to my file server. I don't want to back that up. I'm going to add an exclusion to my backup to exclude files of a certain sort in one of those locations. Maybe I want to keep out a particular folder that tends to attract unwanted stuff. I don't have a representative example here. I'm just going to grab my iSCSI Virtual Disks folder, for example. Having identified the location where that belongs, I can now say that I want to avoid star.jpg files. Anything that's a JPEG image in that folder, I don't want to back it up. Do I want to apply that just to that folder, or do I want to apply it to that folder and all of its child folders that lie below it? Is that third option. My other option at my disposal here is Volume Shadow Copy Services Settings, VSS. Volume Shadow Copy Services, again, is going to be running behind the scenes in my backup. We'll see that when I trigger the backup, the Volume Shadow Copy Service is going to trigger a Volume Shadow Copy snapshot. And the reason why is to be able to get around the problem of open files. When I try to do a backup of a server, it's possible that some of the files on that server are in use by some program. The challenge with which is, what do I do with those files? I need to make sure that we're able to get important data backed up, but that file's in use by its program. I don't really want to stop that program and shut down the server effectively in order to back everything up. So what do I do? Well, VSS has the capability to politely ask an application to put its work on hold ever so briefly so that VSS can make a copy of its files, to be able to render a snapshot of the data that that application is working on. That works for applications that support something called a VSS writer, W-R-I-T-E-R. All of Microsoft software supports a VSS writer, and many other modern applications are designed to be able to provide support for that feature of the operating system. The question being answered in this dialog box is whether there are other applications that I'm using for backup in addition to Windows Server Backup. If I am, I probably want to choose the second option, the one that's currently set by default, VSS Copy. In which case, we are going to create a volume shadow copy snapshot so that I can do a backup of the snapshot, leaving open files open. But that backup will take place in such a way that doesn't tamper with the way the drive otherwise looks from the perspective of those other backup applications that I use. Choosing full backup is what I would do if I'm using Windows Server Backup as my only backup and restore tool. In which case, after VSS has done that shadow copy, it goes ahead and updates backup history for those files, clears log files about that process because nobody cares but itself. It's already done everything that it needs to do, so VSS can tidy up after itself a little bit in a way that it probably shouldn't do if some other backup service is anticipating seeing things appear in a certain way. Having done all of that, I'm going to click OK. I'm actually going to leave this as a copy backup. Having done that, I can click Next. So for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to use local drives. I'm going to back up locally from one disk to another. I'm picking data up from drive C, and you can see here that I'm going to move it to drive E. I have my choice of whatever available partitions are on that system. In this case, E is the logical choice. Having clicked Next, confirms my choices. I click Backup, and it starts the backup process. As it starts the backup, I want you to notice the fact that one of the first things that the backup tool does is to begin doing a volume shadow copy snapshot. That's important to be aware of, because what the backup tool is doing is it's notifying VSS, Volume Shadow Copy Services, saying, hey, I'm about to do a backup through this area. Could you ask all of the applications that are currently writing to files in this area to pause what they're doing for just a moment so that we can take a snapshot of those files at that consistent point in time? We want a picture of what these files look like at that particular point in time so that we can restore them back to a consistent state later. So this next part of the video is going to take a minute or two here, but this is now going to run much faster than it would in real life. And there we go. We've backed up our content. I'm going to click my Close button, and it drops us out of the backup wizard. You see the backup tool does keep track of the backups that you have done, whether they've succeeded or failed, that sort of thing. And our most recent effort was a success. We got our data where we needed it to go. So far, so good. So the next thing I want to do is to be able to go recover data, but I actually want to draw your attention to a couple of important points. Let me jump back to my slides here for a moment. I want to pause for a moment to note a couple of important changes in the tool that may be worth being alert to. One of them, of course, is the bare metal restore. We actually saw that come by in the demo just a moment ago. But I do want to point out some things that aren't obvious from what we saw so far. First is that we can no longer back up data directly to magnetic tape. Long-standing feature of the tool allows you to back up to DAT tapes. Microsoft chose to remove that feature with the Server 2008 and 2002 releases. There are other solutions, some of which are sold by Microsoft, that do have tape backup support, but the free tool no longer includes that feature, so something to build into your planning if you're considering using Windows Server Backup. Another interesting change is the Microsoft Online Backup service, where I back up to the cloud. That'll be a subject of a different lesson. And Windows Server Backup does give us the option to specify full or incremental backups. The option of the so-called differential backup has been removed from this release of Windows Server Backup. Let me show you how to be able to configure a full versus an incremental. And I'll configure that option here on server 1 by choosing the Configure Performance link over here. Configure Performance brings up this dialog box called Optimize Backup Performance. And all that really means is that we're choosing either a normal backup, backing up, in other words, the entire set of data that's in that particular location, versus choosing what's effectively an incremental backup. It's here labeled Faster Backup Performance. But look at the description. Increase the backup speed by just tracking the changes between the last and current backup. Well, that's called an incremental backup. I'm backing up just the changes that took place since the last backup. As long as I've got one normal backup, a complete set of all data over at a particular point in time, if I then have a series of incremental backups, each of which includes the changes since the last incremental or since the normal backup in the case of the first incremental, I've got a complete set of all the changes from a given point in time up through the present. When I go to do a restore, I can restore the original normal backup plus each of the series of incremental backups, the combination of which will restore my data back to the point in time of the last backup that I took prior to whatever damaging crash took place. So I get my choice of those two options. Normal is the default, and that was the one that you saw that I used a moment ago to do my backup. But I can pick and choose which particular volumes in my backup I want to do a full backup for, which ones I want to do an incremental backup for. So be alert to the fact that you've got that choice available to you here. In this case, I'm going to ignore that dialog box. We've already done a backup that used normal backup, and I'm going to cancel out of this dialog box. Let's do a restore. I'm going to click my recover link, and that launches the GUI with which I'll be able to do a restore. The restore process presents us with a couple of important decisions to make, one of which is where are we going to put the data that we're restoring. The obvious choice would be to say, we'll put it back where it belongs. If I backed it up from a particular directory, we'll put the restored data back in that directory. That seems logical enough, but there may be some cases where I'm hesitant to do that. And once again, that might be the case where what I backed up was a whole partition or a whole folder of data, and what's actually damaged is just one file from that folder. In which case, I might want to restore that folder to an alternate location where I can compare the restored copy with the current version and be able to copy in just those files that I need to get my system back and running the way that I want it to be. My other option is to do my choice of a restore of part of my available data or do a full bare metal restore of the whole server, assuming I took a bare metal backup. So I need to think carefully about what am I trying to accomplish here. If I've got a server that was badly damaged and all of my drives were damaged and I replaced them all, bare metal restore is almost certainly the way to go. There might be some possibility that I restore just some piece of that data to some other server, but probably I want to reconstitute that whole server in its entirety. Using a bare metal restore is a logical thing to do. In other cases, again, I just want to get some of that data, in which case a partial is a good choice. Let's take a look at how the GUI implements that idea. So here on server 1, I get to specify where my backup is located. If I'd backed up to a remote location, I could choose that location here. In this case, it is a local backup, so I'm going to choose it's on this server. And we can see here that I did do a backup a little bit earlier on. I want to restore that backup. So I'm going to click Next. And it wants to know what I want to restore. And it's intelligently looking into what I've backed up to be able to see what sorts of things it can logically retrieve from that backup. And it sees two options. It sees the ability to restore particular files and folders. It sees the option to restore volumes, all the data that was backed up from a particular drive. In this case, I want particular files and folders, so I'll choose that. Not available in this option, Hyper-V. I didn't back up any virtual machines. I didn't back up whole applications. Those are applications that have done the legwork of registering their presence with Windows Server Backup. Or, again, system state. We touched on that idea earlier. In this case, I want to restore files and folders. The system thinks for a moment and gives me the option to view the list of available pieces of data. In which case, I want to restore that important data folder with its important file. I'm going to click Next. And there's my choice of putting it in the original location or putting it somewhere altogether different. In this case, original location is fine. The question answered by this next section, what happens if there's a duplication of file names? What if the data that I'm restoring to the drive collides with a file that already has the name of the file that I'm restoring from the backup? And I get my choice of creating a duplicate, creating a copy of the new one to be able to have both so I can cross-compare after the fact. I can clobber the original, throw it away and replace it with the new one, or just don't restore the ones that are already there. Because if the file's already there, I know that it's good. I'm trying to recover deleted files, perhaps in this case, files that are still in fact present, I don't need to bother trying to restore. And do I want to set the permissions back to where they were at the time that I created them? In general, the answer to that question will be, of course, yes. Having done that, I'm ready to start my recovery, and my data is copied back to where it came from. So Windows Server is a valid, maybe a little bit underloved, but valid tool for doing backup and restore of day-to-day files. It can become an important part of your backup and restore regime. One nice benefit of it is that it's free. It comes with the operating system. So you may want to consider taking a second look at Windows Server Backup and exploring it as part of your backup regime. I hope the combination of this tool and the Volume Shadow Copy Services environment will be able to help streamline your backup and restore process in your organization. And I look forward to sharing more with you in another lesson.